I never thought it would come to this. I never imagined my world would collapse in such an agonizing way, with one simple truth tearing apart everything I believed in. I thought we were different. I thought he was different. But in the end, I was just another woman left behind by the man who promised to love her forever. It started with a feeling, an unsettling shift, like the floor beneath my feet had suddenly tilted. At first, I brushed it off. Marriages have ups and downs, right? We were busy, distracted, caught up in the chaos of work and parenting. Our son, Ethan, was 6 and full of energy, needing constant attention. Between his school activities and our own packed schedules, we barely had time to breathe, let alone connect like we used to. But then little things began to pile up. Late-night work meetings that seemed suspiciously frequent. His phone, which used to be left carelessly on the kitchen counter, was suddenly always in his pocket or face down on the table. He'd grown distant, emotionally absent, like there was a wall between us that I couldn't break through. And when I asked if something was wrong, he just smiled that tired smile and reassured me. "It's just work, Anna. You're worrying too much." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. But a part of me, deep down, knew something wasn't right. Then came the night that confirmed everything. He was in the shower, and his phone buzzed on the nightstand. I'm not proud of what I did, but in that moment, I couldn't stop myself. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst as I reached for it, hands trembling. There were so many times before that I'd told myself I was being paranoid, that I should trust him. But this time, I had to know. And then I saw it. A text message from her. "I miss you too. When can we meet again?" It was like the ground fell away beneath me. I could barely breathe as I scrolled up through their messages, each one worse than the last. The words blurred in front of my eyes as my worst fears were confirmed. Months of lies, stolen moments, secret rendezvous. And all the while, I had been here, living in blissful ignorance, believing in us, in our family, in him. I didn't hear the shower turn off. Didn't hear the bathroom door open. My mind was spinning, lost in the storm of betrayal, until his voice jolted me back to reality. "What are you doing?" I looked up to see him standing in the doorway, a towel wrapped around his waist, his eyes wide with shock. He didn't even need to ask. He knew. "You're having an affair." My voice cracked, barely above a whisper, as I held up his phone, showing him the evidence. His face drained of color, and for a second, he just stood there, frozen. Then, he did the worst thing he could have done in that moment. He lied. "It's not what it looks like, Anna," he stammered, taking a step toward me. "I can explain." But I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want his excuses, his half-baked attempts to make me feel like I was overreacting. I threw the phone onto the bed and stood up, my chest heaving with anger, hurt, betrayal, all of it crashing over me at once. "Explain?" I spat the word out like poison. "Explain how you've been lying to me for months? How you've been sneaking around behind my back? How you've destroyed everything we built together?" Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and uncontrollable. I wanted to scream, to tear apart everything in that room, in our house, in our life. I wanted to hurt him the way he had hurt me, but all I could do was stand there, shaking, while he tried to come up with some pathetic excuse to cover his tracks. "Anna, please listen." "No," I cut him off, my voice hardening. Don't you dare. You don't get to explain this away. You don't get to make me feel like I'm the one who's overreacting. You've ruined us, David. You've ruined everything." He reached out to me, but I stepped back, not wanting his touch, not wanting anything from him. The sight of him, the man I had loved, the man I had trusted, was unbearable. "I need you to leave," I said, my voice trembling with finality. "I can't even look at you right now." For a moment, he just stood there, silent, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. But then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. I listened as his footsteps echoed down the hall, and a moment later, I heard the front door close behind him. And just like that, he was gone. I collapsed onto the bed, my body shaking with sobs. It felt like my heart had been ripped out of my chest, like the life we had built together was nothing but a lie, a cruel joke. I had no idea what I was supposed to do next. How could I even begin to pick up the pieces when everything had fallen apart so completely? The night stretched on, endless and suffocating, as I lay there in the dark, alone with the unbearable weight of my shattered world. The morning came, but it brought no relief. If anything, the daylight only made everything worse. The house was silent, too silent, without Ethan's laughter or David's usual morning routine. I had called my sister, Lauren, late last night after David left, begging her to take Ethan for the weekend. I couldn't face my son, not when my entire world was in pieces. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think. Every breath felt like an effort, every movement like I was wading through quicksand. I wanted to stay in bed, to hide under the covers and pretend none of this was real. But I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the cold, hard truth. My husband, the man I had given everything to, had betrayed me. The worst part was the questions, the endless, torturous questions that ran through my mind on an endless loop. Why? Why did he do it? Was it my fault? Did I not love him enough? Was I not enough? I didn't know how long I sat there, staring at the walls, lost in my own misery. Hours, maybe. Time seemed meaningless. It wasn't until the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand pulled me out of my daze that I realized the sun had already begun to set. It was Lauren. Hey, her voice was soft, cautious, as if she didn't want to break me any more than I already was. How are you holding up? I couldn't even form the words. How was I supposed to answer that? How was I supposed to explain the utter devastation, the hollow ache that had settled in my chest? I don't know, I whispered, my voice cracking. I don't know what to do. Do you want me to come over? She asked, and for a moment, I almost said yes. I almost begged her to come and sit with me, to hold me while I fell apart. But then I remembered Ethan. He needed her more than I did right now. No, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. Stay with Ethan. He needs you. There was a pause on the other end, and then Lauren spoke again, her voice filled with quiet strength. You're stronger than you think, Anna. You'll get through this. And when you're ready, I'll be right here. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I wasn't sure if I believed her, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was the sheer will to survive. But whatever it was, it gave me the strength to stand up, to move, to breathe. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The next few days blurred together into a haze of grief and numbness. I moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding the places that held the strongest memories of David. The kitchen table where we used to sit and talk for hours after Ethan went to bed. The couch where we would curl up together on lazy Sunday afternoons, watching movies and stealing kisses like we were still teenagers. Every corner of our home was haunted by what used to be, and now felt like a mockery of the life we'd built, a life that had been so easy to tear apart. I went through the motions. I called my boss and told him I needed time off, citing some vague family emergency that he didn't press me on. I couldn't even imagine going back to work and pretending everything was fine, smiling at colleagues, answering emails, pretending like my world wasn't collapsing. Lauren kept Ethan for the next few days, which was a blessing. I missed him terribly, but I knew I couldn't face him yet, not while I was still this broken. How was I supposed to explain to my son that his father had betrayed us both? How could I possibly protect him from the truth without destroying him? On the third day, I forced myself out of bed. I had to do something. Sitting in the dark, drowning in my own misery, wasn't going to help me figure out what to do next. I needed answers. I needed to understand how this had happened. And the only person who could give me those answers was David. I hadn't heard from him since that night. Not a call, not a text, nothing. It was like he had vanished from my life entirely, leaving behind only the wreckage of his betrayal.
Part of me wanted it that way.
Part of me wanted to never see his face again, to erase him from my life as easily as he had erased our marriage. But another part of me, the part that was still clinging to some shred of hope, some desperate need for closure, knew I couldn't move on until I heard the truth from him. So I called him. My heart was pounding in my chest as I waited for him to answer. With every ring, I braced myself for his voice, for the flood of emotions I knew would come the moment I heard it. But when the call went to voicemail, I was almost relieved. "David," I said, my voice shaky but steady enough. "We need to talk. I need answers. You owe me that much. I'll be home tonight. Please just come." I hung up before I could second-guess myself, before the weight of what I was asking could crush me. And then I waited. The hours dragged by, and with each passing minute, my anxiety grew. What if he didn't come? What if he refused to give me the closure I so desperately needed? Or worse, what if he came, but his answers only hurt me more? By the time the doorbell finally rang, it was already dark outside. My hands were trembling as I opened the door, and there he was, standing on the porch, looking as lost and broken as I felt. His hair was a mess, his eyes tired and red-rimmed, like he hadn't slept in days. He looked like a stranger to me. The man I had loved was gone, replaced by this shell of a person who had destroyed our life together. "Anna," he began, but I held up a hand, stopping him before he could say another word. "Don't," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "Just come in." He stepped inside, and for a moment, we just stood there in the entryway, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. I didn't know where to start, didn't know how to find the words to express the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. But I couldn't stand the silence any longer.
Why?
The word came out barely above a whisper, but it held all the weight of my shattered heart. "Why did you do it, David? Why did you cheat on me?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes fell to the floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, as if he could hide from the truth. But there was no hiding from this. Not anymore. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I made a mistake, Anna. A terrible mistake." I shook my head, anger bubbling up inside me. "A mistake? A mistake? You don't accidentally cheat on someone, David. You don't just stumble into someone else's bed. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. You chose to betray me." He flinched at my words, and for a moment, I felt a cruel sense of satisfaction.
Good.
He deserved to feel every bit of the pain he'd caused me. But it wasn't enough. I needed more than just his guilt. I needed the truth. "Was it just sex?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. "Or was it more than that?" David hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. My heart clenched in my chest, the air leaving my lungs in a sharp, painful exhale. It wasn't just about the sex," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I mean, it was at first, but then, I don't know. Things just got out of hand." I turned away from him, unable to look at him anymore. My stomach churned at the thought of him with someone else, sharing the intimacy that was supposed to be ours, giving a part of himself to another woman while I was here, at home, oblivious to it all. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure I wanted to know, but I had to. I had to put a face to the woman who had taken my husband from me. David hesitated again, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he spoke, his voice hollow. "Her name is Jess. We met at work."
Jess.
The name was like a knife in my chest. I didn't know her, but that didn't matter. She had become a part of my life in the worst possible way. "How long?" I asked, each word feeling like it was tearing me apart from the inside. "How long has it been going on?" 6 months, he admitted quietly. 6 months. Half a year. For 6 months, he had been lying to me, sneaking around behind my back, living a double life while I was here, believing in the illusion of our marriage. I felt like I was going to be sick. "I never wanted to hurt you, Anna," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear I didn't. I didn't know how to stop it." I turned to face him, my eyes burning with tears I refused to let fall. "You didn't know how to stop it?" I repeated, incredulous. "You stop it by not starting it in the first place, David. You stop it by remembering that you have a wife and a son who love you, who trust you." He looked like he wanted to say something, to defend himself, but I wasn't interested in hearing his excuses anymore. I had heard enough. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking with barely contained anger. "Just get out. Anna, please. Get out," I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat with a ferocity that surprised even me. David flinched again, but he didn't argue. He turned and walked to the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. And just like that, he was gone again, leaving me alone in the empty, hollow shell of our home. The days that followed were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. David didn't try to contact me again, and for that I was grateful. But even in his absence, the pain of his betrayal lingered like a poison in my veins. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of the life we used to have, the life we would never get back. I threw myself into taking care of Ethan, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for his sake. He was too young to understand what had happened, too innocent to know the truth. All he knew was that Daddy wasn't home, and that Mommy was sad. I tried to hide it from him, but kids are perceptive. He knew something was wrong, even if he didn't have the words to express it. "Is Daddy coming home soon?" he asked me one night as I tucked him into bed. I froze, the question hitting me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know how to answer him. How could I explain to my 6-year-old that his father had left us, not just physically, but emotionally? "I don't know, sweetheart," I said softly, stroking his hair. "But I'm here. I'm always here." He nodded, his little face scrunched up in confusion, but he didn't ask any more questions. Instead, he wrapped his arms around me, clinging to me like I was the only anchor in his world. And maybe I was. Weeks passed, and life began to settle into a strange new rhythm. I focused on Ethan and tried to put on a brave face for him, even though inside, I was barely holding it together. I told myself that I was strong, that I could survive this. But the truth was, I felt like I was drowning, weighed down by the crushing reality of David's betrayal. At night, after Ethan had gone to bed, the silence of the house felt unbearable. I couldn't escape the memories of what we used to be, of what we had lost. Every part of this house was a reminder of him, of us. Our life together had been woven into every piece of furniture, every photo on the walls, every creak in the floorboards. And now, all those things were tainted by his lies, his infidelity. I spent hours staring at my phone, torn between wanting to talk to him and hating him for what he had done. Some nights, I almost called him, just to hear his voice, to ask him why all over again, as if that could change anything. But I knew it wouldn't. The damage was done, and there was no going back. He had broken something between us that could never be repaired. Lauren was my lifeline during those early weeks. She came by almost every day, sometimes just to sit with me in silence, sometimes to drag me out of the house for a walk or a coffee. She didn't push me to talk about David, didn't force me to confront the pain before I was ready. She just was there, and that was enough. "You're stronger than you think, Anna," she reminded me every time I started to fall apart. "You'll get through this. You just have to take it one day at a time." I nodded whenever she said that, even though I didn't always believe her. Some days, it felt like I would never be whole again, like the pieces of my heart were too shattered to ever fit back together. But for Ethan's sake, I had to keep going. I couldn't let him see how much I was hurting. He had already lost his father. He couldn't lose his mother too. And then, one afternoon, as I was going through the motions of cleaning up after dinner, my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at it, expecting another message from Lauren, or maybe one of Ethan's teachers. But it wasn't. It was David. "David, can we talk? I miss Ethan. I miss you." My heart stopped. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, unable to process the flood of emotions that hit me all at once. Anger, sadness, longing, confusion. Part of me wanted to throw the phone across the room, to delete his message and pretend I hadn't seen it. But another part of me, the part that was still aching from his absence, still desperate for some kind of resolution, wanted to respond. I wanted to know what he had to say, wanted to hear his voice, even if it hurt me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. What could he possibly say that would make this better? That would undo the damage he had done? And yet, a part of me wanted to know. A part of me needed to know if there was anything left to salvage. Finally, my fingers moved, almost to their own accord, typing out a response before I could stop myself. Me. What is there to talk about, David? You made your choice. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for his reply. It came almost immediately. David, I know I messed up.
I'm so sorry, Anna.
I never meant to hurt you. Please, just give me a chance to explain. Explain. That word again. As if there was some explanation that could make this right. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that I didn't need his apologies or his explanations, that he had already destroyed everything. But before I could respond, another message came through. David, I want to see Ethan.
He needs his father.
That stopped me. As angry as I was, as hurt as I was, I couldn't deny that Ethan deserved to see his dad. He had been asking about David more frequently, his little face full of confusion every time I gave him another vague excuse for why his father wasn't home. I couldn't keep lying to him, couldn't keep pretending like David didn't exist. As much as I wanted to cut David out of my life completely, I knew that Ethan needed him. I sighed, running a hand through my hair, feeling the weight of the decision I had to make. I couldn't deny David access to his son, not without hurting Ethan in the process. But I wasn't ready to face him, not yet. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be ready. Me, you can see Ethan. But not here. I'll drop him off at your mom's this weekend. There was a long pause before his response came. David,
Thank you, Anna.
I appreciate it. That was it. No further apologies, no more attempts to explain or justify what he had done. Just a simple acknowledgement, as if he knew that pushing me any further right now would only make things worse. I put the phone down and stared at the kitchen, suddenly feeling exhausted. I didn't know what I expected from this conversation, but I knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. Saturday came, and with it, a knot of anxiety in my stomach that I couldn't shake. I had spent the entire week trying to mentally prepare myself for this moment, but no amount of preparation could dull the ache I felt as I packed a bag for Ethan, knowing he was going to see David without me. It felt wrong, like a part of me was being ripped away, even though I knew it was the right thing to do for my son. Are we going to Daddy's house? Ethan asked as I helped him zip up his coat. His little voice was full of innocent excitement, like this was just another normal weekend visit, like nothing had changed. Not exactly, I said, forcing a smile. You're going to Grandma's house today, and Daddy will meet you there. Ethan nodded, satisfied with the answer, but my heart ached. He didn't understand the complexity of what was happening. All he knew was that he was going to see his dad, and that was enough for him.
For now.
The drive to David's mother's house was quiet. Ethan was chattering away in the back seat, oblivious to the tension that hung in the air. But my mind was elsewhere, spinning with 1,000 thoughts, memories of David, our life together, and the man I thought I knew. How had we gotten here? How had everything fallen apart so completely? When we arrived, David was already there, standing on the front porch with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking nervous. I parked the car and took a deep breath, bracing myself for the moment I would have to see him again, face to face. Ethan unbuckled himself and ran to David the moment he stepped out of the car, throwing his arms around his dad with all the enthusiasm of a child who had missed him terribly. David scooped him up, hugging him tight, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But that flicker was quickly snuffed out by the reality of what he had done. I stayed by the car, watching the two of them, my arms crossed over my chest, as if that could shield me from the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. David glanced over at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe? Guilt? It didn't matter. I couldn't let myself care. Anna, he said, his voice soft, as he put Ethan down. Thank you. I know this isn't easy for you. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. If I opened my mouth, I wasn't sure what would come out. Anger, sadness, or some messy mix of both. I'll pick him up tomorrow, I said quickly, my voice clipped. Same time. David nodded, and for a moment, it looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. He just looked at me with those eyes that used to make me feel so safe, so loved, and now only reminded me of everything I had lost. I turned away before the tears could start to fall and got back in the car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Ethan wave goodbye to me from David's arms, his face full of joy. And for the first time in weeks, I realized that this was going to be my new reality, a life where David and I were no longer us, but two separate people trying to navigate the wreckage of what we used to be. I drove back home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The empty seat in the back, where Ethan usually sat, felt like a gaping hole in my chest. I should have felt some relief that he was with David, that I had a moment to myself to breathe, to think. But all I could feel was a deep sense of loss, like a part of me had been taken away. This was the new normal, I reminded myself. This was what it meant to live without David. The house felt even emptier when I walked in. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, I stood in the middle of the living room, unsure of what to do with myself. I had spent so much of my time focusing on Ethan, keeping myself busy with his needs, that now, without him, I felt untethered. I wandered into the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, the simple routine grounding me in a way nothing else could. But as I sat at the table, staring out the window into the backyard where Ethan used to play, the weight of everything came crashing down on me again. I tried to hold it together, but the tears came anyway, hot and relentless, sliding down my cheeks before I could stop them. I didn't know how long I sat there, crying into my tea, but by the time I finally pulled myself together, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the floor. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I couldn't keep falling apart like this. I had to be strong for Ethan, for myself. I had to find a way to move on.
But how?
How do you move on when the person you thought you'd spend your life with rips your world apart? I was still grappling with that question when my phone buzzed on the counter, pulling me out of my spiral of thoughts. It was a message from Lauren. Lauren, how are you holding up? Do you want me to come over? I can bring wine. I smiled faintly at her offer, grateful for her constant support. Lauren had been my rock through all of this, even when I didn't want to admit how much I needed her. But tonight, I didn't want to burden her with my pain. I needed to learn how to handle this on my own, to find my footing without relying on someone else to hold me up. I'm okay. Just had to drop Ethan off with David. I think I'm just going to have a quiet night in. But thanks for checking on me. Lauren's reply came quickly, as always. Lauren, you know I'm here if you need me.
Anytime.
I set my phone down, feeling a wave of gratitude for my sister. But even with her support, I knew that this was something I had to face alone. No one could heal the wounds David had left behind but me. The next day, I went to pick up Ethan from David's mother's house. I had spent the morning dreading the encounter, the thought of seeing David again stirring up a mix of anger, sadness, and something I couldn't quite name, something that felt like longing, despite everything he had done. When I pulled up in front of the house, Ethan came running out to meet me, his face lighting up with excitement. I couldn't help but smile as I scooped him up into my arms, feeling his small hands grip my shoulders tightly. Mommy, we played with Grandma's dog, and Daddy took me to the park, he said, his voice bubbling with enthusiasm. It was so fun. I forced a smile, trying to match his excitement, but the mention of David twisted something deep inside me. I glanced up and saw David standing in the doorway, watching us with a cautious expression. Our eyes met briefly, and for a moment, I was reminded of all the years we had shared, all the good memories that had been overshadowed by his betrayal. I'm glad you had fun, I said, setting Ethan down and straightening his jacket. Go grab your bag from Grandma, okay? Ethan nodded and ran back inside, leaving me alone with David. The air between us felt heavy, charged with all the things left unsaid. I didn't want to be here, standing in front of him, but there was no avoiding it now. How was he? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. David shrugged, stuffing his hands into his pockets like he always did when he was nervous. He was good.
Happy.
We had a nice time. I nodded, not sure what else to say. The silence stretched out between us, thick and uncomfortable. Part of me wanted to demand answers, to ask him again why he had done this to us, but I knew that nothing he said would change what had happened. The damage was done. I'm sorry, Anna, David said suddenly, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. I know I keep saying that, but I don't know how else to tell you how much I regret what I did. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. And if I could take it all back, I would. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening with the weight of his words. I had heard his apologies before, but they still cut deep, reopening wounds that hadn't even begun to heal. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, David, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed our family. You broke my trust, and I don't know if that's something we can come back from. He looked down at his feet, his shoulders slumping with the weight of my words. I understand, he said quietly. I just want to do right by Ethan. I want to be there for him, even if I can't fix things with you. Hearing him say it out loud, that there might be no fixing us, hit me harder than I expected. Part of me wanted to believe that there was still hope, that maybe, somehow, we could find a way to heal. But the other part of me, the part that had been shattered by his betrayal, knew that too much had been broken. I need time, I said, my voice trembling slightly. I don't know what the future looks like, David. I don't know if we'll ever be able to fix this. But I need time to figure things out for myself and for Ethan. He nodded, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. Take all the time you need, he said softly. I'll be here for both of you. With that, Ethan came running back outside, his backpack slung over his shoulder, ready to go home. I gave David one last look before turning to leave, my heart heavy with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. As I drove away, Ethan chatting happily in the back seat, I couldn't help but wonder if there was a future where David and I could find our way back to each other. But for now, all I could do was focus on the present, on healing, on finding my own strength again, on being the best mother I could be for Ethan. The next few months were a blur of trying to rebuild some semblance of normalcy. Ethan was back in school, and I had returned to work, throwing myself into my job as a way to distract myself from the pain that still lingered. Some days were better than others. On the good days, I felt like I could breathe again, like I was finally starting to heal. On the bad days, the weight of David's betrayal felt like it was crushing me all over again. David and I kept our interactions limited to co-parenting. We exchanged polite but distant messages about Ethan, coordinated drop-offs and pickups without ever lingering too long in each other's presence. It was easier that way, easier not to confront the raw, open wounds that still lay between us. But as time passed, I started to feel something I hadn't expected: freedom. It was subtle at first, just a quiet realization that, for the first time in years, I wasn't constantly worrying about David, about our marriage, about whether I was enough. I wasn't spending my days trying to please someone who had already checked out, trying to fix something that was broken beyond repair. Instead, I was focusing on me, on what I wanted, on who I was outside of being a wife and a mother. One evening, after putting Ethan to bed, I found myself scrolling through social media, something I hadn't done in months. As I mindlessly scrolled past pictures of old friends and acquaintances, I stumbled upon a post from a woman I used to work with, Megan. She had recently gone through a divorce too, and her post was full of positivity, talking about how she had rediscovered herself after ending her marriage. She talked about the joy of finding new hobbies, of exploring new relationships, of learning to love herself again. It struck a chord with me, and for the first time in a long time, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward for me too. That night, after seeing Megan's post, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her words echoed in my mind, and I found myself thinking about the woman I used to be before my world revolved around David and Ethan. It had been so long since I'd thought about my own needs, my own happiness. Somewhere along the way, I had lost myself. I had become David's wife and Ethan's mom, but who was I beyond that? What did I want from life? The questions swirled in my mind, and though I didn't have all the answers yet, I knew one thing: I couldn't let David's betrayal define me. I had spent so much time mourning the life we'd had, the future I thought we would share, but now I needed to focus on my own future, on what I wanted next for me and for Ethan. The next morning, I woke up with a new sense of determination. It wasn't a dramatic shift. I still carried the weight of everything that had happened, but there was a spark of something inside me that I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the first flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a life waiting for me beyond the ruins of my marriage. I decided to start small, to make time for myself in ways I hadn't before. I took up running again, something I used to love before Ethan was born. It was hard at first, my legs protesting with every step, but there was something therapeutic about the steady rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement, the way my thoughts quieted as I focused on the physical challenge. It gave me space to think, or not think, about everything that had happened. And for the first time in months, I started to feel like I was regaining control over my life. Lauren noticed the change in me almost immediately. "You're looking better, Anna," she said one afternoon when she stopped by for coffee. "Happier, even." I smiled, stirring my mug. "I'm trying," I admitted. "It's still hard, some days are harder than others. But I realized that I can't keep living in the past. I need to start thinking about my future." Lauren nodded, a proud smile on her face. "That's the Anna I know. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." Her words warmed me, but they also reminded me of something else, something I had been avoiding thinking about for months. David. As much as I was trying to move forward, he was still a constant presence in my life, through Ethan, through our shared history. And while I had kept things as distant as possible between us, I knew that sooner or later, I would have to confront the reality of what our relationship had become. One Friday evening, as I was getting ready to pick Ethan up from David's house, I received an unexpected message. "David, do you want to come inside for a bit when you pick Ethan up? I made dinner. I thought we could talk." I stared at my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. It had been months since David had suggested anything beyond the basic logistics of co-parenting. We had settled into a routine, exchanging Ethan with brief, polite interactions, but nothing more. Now, suddenly, he was asking me to come in, to talk. Why now? A flood of emotions rushed through me. Anger, confusion, sadness, and, buried deep beneath all of that, a strange sense of curiosity. What did he want to say? Was this his way of trying to make amends? Or was it something else entirely? For a long moment, I considered ignoring the message. Part of me wanted nothing more than to keep things as they were, distant, detached. But another part of me, the part that still carried unresolved questions, couldn't let it go. I needed to know what he wanted to say, if only to find closure for myself. "Me okay? I'll come in for a bit." I sent the message before I could second-guess myself, and immediately felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. What was I doing? Was I really ready to face him like this, in the home we used to share, surrounded by the ghosts of our past? The drive to David's house felt longer than usual. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I mentally prepared myself for whatever conversation was about to happen. When I pulled up in front of the house, Ethan came running out to greet me, as he always did, his face lighting up with excitement. "Mommy, Daddy made spaghetti. It's really good," he said, bouncing on his feet as I helped him into the car. I forced a smile, my heart pounding. "I'm glad you liked it, sweetheart." Once Ethan was settled in the back seat, I took a deep breath and headed for the front door. David opened it before I could knock, standing there with a nervous expression on his face. He looked different, thinner, more tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of sympathy, despite everything. "Hey," he said quietly, stepping aside to let me in. "Thanks for coming." I nodded, stepping inside the house. The smell of spaghetti filled the air, and the familiarity of it, of our old routine, hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't been in this house since the night I found out about the affair. It felt strange being here now, like stepping into a life that wasn't mine anymore. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared countless meals as a family. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching out between us like a chasm. I could feel the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on me, but I wasn't going to be the one to break the silence. I had come here to listen, to hear what he had to say. Finally, David cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting on the table. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "About everything. About us. And I know I messed up in the worst way possible. I hurt you. I hurt Ethan. And I don't know if there's any way to make that right. But I want to try. I stared at him, my heart racing. David, I don't know what you expect me to say. You broke my trust. You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed our family. I know, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I know I did. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect us to get back together. But I wanted to tell you that I'm working on myself. I've been going to therapy, trying to understand why I did what I did. I've realized how selfish I was, how I took you for granted. And I'm sorry, Anna. I really am. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I had spent months replaying the betrayal in my mind, reliving the hurt over and over again. I had imagined this conversation countless times, and yet, now that it was happening, I didn't feel the catharsis I thought I would. Instead, I just felt tired. Tired of being angry. Tired of carrying the weight of his mistakes. I appreciate that you're trying, I said finally, my voice soft but firm. But I can't promise you anything, David. You broke something between us that I'm not sure can ever be fixed. I've been trying to move on, to focus on myself and Ethan. That's all I can do right now. He nodded, his eyes full of regret. I understand. I wanted you to know that I'm not giving up on being a better person. For Ethan's sake. And maybe for us, too. If there's ever a chance. I didn't respond to that. I couldn't. The thought of us being anything more than co-parents felt impossible right now, and I wasn't ready to entertain it. Instead, I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. Thank you for dinner, I said quietly. But I should get going. Ethan's waiting. David nodded, standing up as well. Of course. Thank you for coming. As I walked out the door and back to the car, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. The conversation hadn't given me the closure I had hoped for, but it had given me something else. Clarity. I wasn't ready to forgive David, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. But I didn't need to make that decision right now. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life again. And for now, that was enough. Over the next few months, life continued to shift in ways I hadn't expected. My relationship with David remained distant but civil, centered solely around Ethan. There were no more invitations for dinner, no more heartfelt apologies. We communicated only when necessary, and while it wasn't always easy, it worked. We had found a fragile balance between co-parenting and moving on with our separate lives. In the meantime, I focused on myself. I signed up for an art class at the local community center, something I had always wanted to do, but never made time for. At first, it felt strange, being around new people, doing something just for me. But slowly, I started to enjoy it. The act of creating something with my hands, of getting lost in the process, became a form of therapy for me. One evening, after class, I found myself lingering in the parking lot, not quite ready to go home. That's when I noticed him. A man I had seen in class a few times, always sitting near the back, quietly working on his own projects. He was tall, with dark hair and a kind smile, and tonight, for the first time, he approached me. Hey, he said, his voice warm and friendly. I'm Luke, by the way. I've seen you in class a few times, but I don't think we've ever officially met. I smiled, surprised by how easy it felt to talk to him. I'm Anna. Nice to meet you. We ended up talking for nearly an hour, standing in the cool evening air, discussing everything from art to books to the simple joys of finding something new to be passionate about. There was no pressure, no awkwardness, just two people connecting over shared interests. When I finally drove home that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not just for the future, but for myself. I wasn't sure where things with Luke might go, if anywhere, but the mere fact that I was open to the possibility felt like a step forward. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about the journey I had been on, the heartbreak, the anger, the slow process of healing. It wasn't over yet. I still had days where the weight of it all felt overwhelming, but for the first time in a long time, I believed that I could come out the other side stronger. Maybe David had broken something between us that could never be repaired. But that didn't mean I was broken. It didn't mean my life was over. I still had so much ahead of me, So much left to discover about myself, about what I wanted from this new chapter of my life. And as I drifted off to sleep, I found myself smiling, feeling lighter than I had in months. The months that followed brought more changes, both big and small, as I slowly started to rebuild my life. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the weight of David's betrayal crept back in, when the loneliness felt overwhelming, when the memories of our old life together stung more than I cared to admit. But with each passing day, I found more strength in myself, more hope for the future. I was beginning to realize that healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy and complicated, full of setbacks and breakthroughs. My relationship with David remained strictly co-parenting, and over time, I grew more comfortable with that. There were no grand reconciliations, no moments where everything suddenly fell into place. But there was peace in the distance we maintained, a mutual understanding that the past couldn't be undone. He was there for Ethan, and that was all I needed from him now. As for Ethan, he seemed to adapt to our new reality better than I had expected. He still had his moments of confusion, asking why Daddy didn't live with us anymore, but I did my best to explain it to him in a way that made sense for a 6-year-old. He was resilient, just like I was learning to be, and seeing him happy gave me the strength to keep going, even on the hard days. Luke, the man I had met in my art class, became a quiet but steady presence in my life. We started spending more time together, meeting for coffee after class, talking about everything from our creative projects to our personal lives. He was easy to be around, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I found myself laughing again, feeling light and free in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It wasn't even necessarily a romance at first. It was friendship, genuine, uncomplicated, and exactly what I needed. But over time, as we grew closer, I realized that there was something more there. Luke was patient, kind, and supportive, never pushing me to move faster than I was ready for. He understood that I was still healing, still figuring out who I was in the wake of everything that had happened. One evening, after we had finished another art class together, Luke walked me to my car, as he always did. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the parking lot, and for a moment, we stood there in comfortable silence, watching the sky change colors. "Anna," he said after a while, his voice gentle, "I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want to rush you into anything you're not ready for. But I just wanted you to know, I care about you. I like being around you, and I'd like to see where this could go, if you're open to it." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt the familiar flutter of uncertainty. I had spent so long guarding my heart, protecting myself from more pain, that the thought of opening up to someone again felt both exciting and terrifying. But as I looked at Luke, standing there with his kind eyes and patient smile, I realized that I didn't have to be afraid anymore. "I care about you too, Luke," I said softly, meeting his gaze. "And I think I'm ready. Slowly, but I'm ready." He smiled then, a smile that made me feel warm and safe, and in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, I was going to be okay. I was no longer the woman who had been shattered by betrayal. I was someone stronger now, someone who had fought to rebuild herself piece by piece. We didn't rush things. We took our time, getting to know each other in new ways, letting the connection between us grow naturally. There was no pressure, no urgency, just the steady unfolding of something real, something good. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that I deserved this, that I deserved happiness, love, and a future that wasn't defined by the mistakes of the past. As the months went on, Luke became more integrated into my life, meeting Ethan, joining us for family outings, and slowly becoming a part of the world I was rebuilding. It wasn't perfect, and I knew there would always be challenges ahead, but I had learned that I was capable of handling whatever came my way. David, too, had settled into his new role. He remained a consistent presence in Ethan's life, and though our relationship would never be what it once was, we had found a way to coexist peacefully. We were no longer enemies, nor were we the partners we had once been. We were something in between, two people who had shared a life, and now shared a responsibility to the son we both loved. As time passed, I found myself thinking less and less about the past, and more about the future. I no longer felt the sting of David's betrayal as acutely as I once had. The pain had dulled, softened into a distant memory, a part of my story, but not the whole of it. I had learned to let go, not just of David, but of the anger, the bitterness, the need for answers that would never come. One evening, after a long day of work, I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun set over the yard. Ethan was playing with his toys on the grass, his laughter filling the air, and Luke was sitting beside me, his hand resting lightly on mine. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly content. Not because everything was perfect, far from it, but because I had finally found peace within myself. I had learned that life didn't always turn out the way we expected, that people could disappoint us, that hearts could break. But I had also learned that healing was possible, that new beginnings were always within reach, and that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. I wasn't defined by David's betrayal. I wasn't defined by the pain I had endured. I was defined by the choices I made after, by the life I had rebuilt from the ashes, by the love I had found for myself and for the people who had come into my life. As I sat there, watching Ethan play and feeling the warmth of Luke's presence beside me, I knew that this was my life now, a life filled with hope, with love, with possibility. And no matter what came next, I was ready for it.